Somewhere in the shadows of this city, a child disappeared without a trace. A mother who lost everything in a single night. A father whose secrets run deeper than anyone could have imagined. And a powerful man who seems to have all the answers. But nothing is what it seems. Lies, betrayals, and hidden truths will lead to a revelation so shocking that no one will ever see it coming. And at the center of it all, a little girl who no longer knows who she is. What happened to Emily Carter? And why does she believe she is not even human anymore? Stay until the end of this story to discover the truth that will change everything. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment below your theories. Because in this mystery, every detail matters. It started on a stormy night, a night so dark and heavy with rain that the city itself seemed to drown in its own secrets. Sarah Carter gripped the steering wheel of her car, her knuckles white, her breath uneven, her heart pounding so loudly that it nearly drowned out the sound of the rain pelting against the windshield. Her hands trembled as she held a letter, crumpled in her lap, the ink smudged from the moisture in the air. The words written on it burned in her mind like a fire she could not put out. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her vision, but her thoughts were a chaotic storm of their own. The headlights of passing cars blurred into streaks of light, her breathing uneven as she glanced in the rearview mirror. In the back seat, Emily, her 5-year-old daughter, was fast asleep, her small body curled up, her hand clutching a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. The innocence of her child, the peaceful rise and fall of her chest, only made Sarah's terror worse. She knew what this meant. She knew what was about to happen. The voice of her husband, Daniel Carter, echoed in her mind. "Sarah, you don't understand what you're doing." His words had been a mixture of frustration, desperation, and something else. Something she couldn't quite place. "You can't take her away. You don't know what you're up against." But she had known. She had known for a long time that something wasn't right. She had ignored the signs, pretended not to see the strange phone calls, the whispered conversations behind closed doors, the sudden disappearances, the unexplained money that kept appearing in their account. But tonight, it was all about to end. The letter in her lap proved it. The truth was finally staring her in the face, and there was no running from it. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel. She had to get away. She had to take Emily and disappear before it was too late. But fate had other plans. The curve on the road came too fast, or maybe her mind was too scattered to react in time. The headlights of an oncoming car flooded her vision, and in a split second, she swerved, the tires skidding on the wet pavement. A scream caught in her throat as the world spun violently, the car sliding off the road, tumbling down an embankment. The last thing she heard before the darkness swallowed her whole was the distant sound of Emily's voice calling her name. Hours passed, maybe minutes, maybe an eternity. The next thing Sarah knew, she was waking up in a hospital bed, the white fluorescent lights above her blinding. Her body ached, her head throbbed, but none of it mattered. One thought cut through the haze of pain and confusion. Emily. Her voice was raw, barely a whisper, but it carried every ounce of desperation in her soul. She tried to sit up, only to be met with the sharp sting of something pulling at her arm, and 4 drip attached to her wrist. Hands were on her shoulders, pressing her down, gentle but firm. A nurse. "Mrs. Carter, please, you need to rest. You've been through a severe accident." But Sarah didn't care. "Where is my daughter?" Her voice rose, panic overtaking every rational thought. "Where is Emily?" The nurse hesitated, and in that moment, Sarah knew something was wrong. The room felt too quiet, the beeping of the machines too distant. "Mrs. Carter," the nurse began cautiously, "your daughter." She wasn't in the car when the paramedics arrived. The world stopped. Sarah's breath hitched. Her pulse pounded in her ears. "No, that's not possible," she whispered. She was right there, in the back seat. She was asleep. The nurse exchanged a look with a man standing in the doorway. A police officer. Detective Michael Carter stepped forward, his face a mask of controlled sympathy. "Mrs. Carter, we've been searching since we found your vehicle." But there was no sign of Emily at the crash site. Sarah's mind reeled. No, 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 you don't understand. She was in the car with me. She was right there. Tears burned her eyes, and her voice cracked with hysteria. You have to find her. Someone must have taken her. But Michael Carter's face didn't change. His eyes held something unreadable. There's something else, he said, his voice careful, measured. We checked the security cameras near the road where you crashed, and we saw something that doesn't make sense. Sarah barely heard him. Her thoughts were spinning, her world unraveling. What do you mean? She demanded, gripping the sheets beneath her. Detective Carter sighed, running a hand through his short-cropped hair before he spoke. The footage shows that before your car lost control, Emily got out. She stepped out onto the road. Alone. Silence. The weight of those words crashed over Sarah like a tidal wave. That's not possible, she breathed. She was sleeping. She was in the back seat. The detective's voice cut through her panic like a blade. The footage doesn't lie. She opened the door and walked out on her own. And then she disappeared. Sarah felt like the air had been stolen from her lungs. She shook her head. No, you're wrong. But the detective only stared at her, his expression grim. We found small footprints leading away from the road. They vanished near a drainage tunnel. We believe she may have gone underground. Underground. The word echoed in Sarah's mind like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Something cold settled in her chest. Something far worse than fear. And for the first time since the accident, she realized with bone-chilling certainty, Emily hadn't just disappeared. Someone had taken her. Or worse, someone had been waiting for her. And whatever had happened that night had been planned all along. Sarah Carter sat frozen in the hospital bed. Her fingers clenched so tightly around the sheets that her knuckles turned white. The detective's words echoed in her mind like a cruel, inescapable refrain. Emily got out of the car before the crash. Alone. The idea was absurd, impossible. Emily was asleep. Sarah had checked on her, had seen her tiny hands gripping that old stuffed rabbit. She had been right there in the back seat, safe. And now she was gone. Her breathing quickened, her chest rising and falling unevenly as panic tightened its grip. No, she whispered, shaking her head. You're wrong. There has to be a mistake. Detective Michael Carter didn't flinch. His posture remained steady, his gaze sharp and unwavering. He had seen this before. Parents in denial, clutching at any possibility that didn't involve the unthinkable. Mrs. Carter, he said slowly, carefully, the footage is clear. Emily left the car before you lost control. We don't know why, but she wasn't there when the vehicle crashed. Sarah's heart pounded violently against her ribs. Then someone took her. She turned to the nurse, to anyone in the room who would listen. You have to find her. Someone. Someone was waiting for her. Someone. Detective Carter held up a hand. We're investigating all possibilities. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed something deeper. Doubt. But there's something else. You need to see this for yourself. Sarah barely registered the moment when the nurse stepped aside, letting Carter pull out a tablet. He tapped the screen a few times before turning it to face her. The video was grainy, taken from a street surveillance camera near the stretch of road where she had crashed. Sarah forced herself to focus, her breath catching as the scene unfolded. Her car came into frame, moving slowly through the rain. It weaved slightly. She remembered feeling lightheaded, struggling to keep her grip on the wheel. But then, something happened that made her blood turn ice cold. The back door opened. Emily stepped out, alone. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth. No, she whispered, shaking her head as if that could undo what she was seeing. Her daughter, her baby, stepping out onto the road as if in a trance. The way she moved, it wasn't hurried, wasn't scared. It was deliberate. Her small feet padded onto the wet asphalt, her little arms hanging limply at her sides. And then she turned. For the briefest second, Emily turned her head toward the camera. Sarah gasped. Something was wrong with her eyes. They weren't panicked, weren't searching for help. There was something hollow in them, something distant. And then, in the next second, she moved out of frame. Gone. Sarah's entire body trembled as she clutched the tablet. Where did she go? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Carter exhaled slowly. That's what we're trying to find out. The last trace of her footprints led to a drainage tunnel about a mile from the crash site. But after that, Sarah's head snapped up. You think she went underground? Carter hesitated. It's a possibility. The tunnels lead deep beneath the city. We have teams searching, but it's not easy. Sarah's mind raced. None of this made sense. Emily was 5 years old. She wouldn't just walk away like that. Not in the middle of the night, not in the rain. And yet, her body had moved without hesitation. Like she knew exactly where she was going. A terrible, suffocating thought wrapped around Sarah's chest. What if she had? What if Emily had been going somewhere? What if someone had told her to? Sarah's hands clenched into fists. I need to see that tunnel. Carter's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Carter, that's not a good idea. I don't care, she snapped, fire rising in her veins. That's my daughter. And if she's down there, then I'm going after her. Carter hesitated, but he saw something in her face. Something unbreakable. He exhaled sharply, nodding. Fine, but you're not going alone. Sarah barely waited for him to finish speaking before she ripped the $4 from her arm. Pain shot up her veins, but she ignored it, throwing back the covers and swinging her legs over the edge of the bed. The nurse tried to protest, but Sarah had already stood, her knees trembling, her body weakened but her will unshaken. Where are my clothes? The next hour was a blur. The hospital reluctantly discharged her under Carter's supervision, and soon, she found herself in the passenger seat of his car, the rain still pouring outside as they drove through the empty streets. The tunnel entrance was marked off with police tape, dim floodlights casting eerie shadows along the cracked pavement. The opening yawned like a black hole in the earth, disappearing into the darkness beneath the city. A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. Carter parked the car and turned to her. You sure about this? Sarah didn't answer. She opened the door and stepped out into the rain. The officers on site hesitated when they saw her, exchanging uncertain glances, but Carter waved them off. He gestured toward the tunnel. This is where the footprints end. Sarah moved forward. The concrete was slick beneath her shoes, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something else. Something metallic, almost like rust. The deeper she walked, the more suffocating the darkness became. Her breath caught when she saw it. Near the entrance, half buried in the mud, was a small stuffed rabbit. Emily's rabbit. Sarah fell to her knees, her fingers clutching the damp fabric as a sob escaped her throat. Emily, she whispered. Carter crouched beside her, his voice softer now. It means she was here. And if she was here... Sarah swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the toy. Then she's still down there. The tunnel stretched before them, a black void swallowing all light. And deep in the distance, something dripped, echoing, like footsteps, or something moving, watching, waiting. Sarah clenched her jaw, her knuckles white against the fabric of Emily's rabbit. She would find her daughter, no matter what it took. The darkness inside the tunnel felt alive. It pressed in from all sides, swallowing what little light the dim flood lamps cast at the entrance. The air was thick, damp, laced with an earthy staleness that clung to the back of Sarah's throat. The moment she stepped past the police barrier, past the last touch of natural light, she felt it. Something ancient, something waiting. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs as she clutched Emily's stuffed rabbit against her chest. Her daughter had been here. Her little hands had held this same toy. Her small feet had touched this same ground. She had been here and now she was gone. Detective Carter's footsteps echoed behind her, steady but cautious. Sarah, he called, voice firm but not unkind. I know you want to do this, but you need to take a breath and think about what happens next. She ignored him. Her pulse roared in her ears as she scanned the concrete walls, the cold floor. Muddy footprints led deeper into the tunnel. Tiny, delicate imprints that sent a violent shiver up her spine. Emily's footprints. They weren't rushed. They weren't stumbling. They were careful, purposeful. as if she had known exactly where she was going. Sarah swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe. She didn't run, she murmured. She wasn't lost. Carter stepped beside her, his eyes tracing the footprints as well. It looks that way, he admitted, which raises the bigger question, why? Why would a 5-year-old girl step out of a moving car and walk straight into a drainage tunnel in the middle of the night? Sarah's grip on the rabbit tightened. Because someone told her to. Carter's gaze snapped to hers. That's a dangerous assumption. It's not an assumption, she shot back. It's the only thing that makes sense. Emily wouldn't just leave like that. She wouldn't just. Her voice cracked, and she turned away, blinking rapidly against the sting in her eyes. She couldn't afford to break down now. She had to keep going. Carter sighed, rubbing his jaw. Even if that's true, we don't know who or why. He turned, signaling to the officers at the entrance. I'll call in reinforcements. We need a full search team down here. Sarah's stomach clenched. We don't have time for that. Sarah, listen to me. No, she snapped, whirling to face him. You listen to me. That's my daughter. And I will not stand here waiting for men with flashlights to show up when every second counts. Carter hesitated, conflict flashing in his eyes. But then he sighed. Fine, but we stay together. Sarah didn't wait for more protests. She turned and walked forward, deeper into the tunnel, following the tiny footprints that led into the abyss. The tunnel stretched endlessly before them, twisting and turning, dipping lower into the earth. The walls were slick with moisture, and somewhere in the distance, water dripped in a slow, steady rhythm. The air was colder here, a sharp contrast to the humid summer night outside. Felt wrong, unnatural. And then, just when Sarah thought she could bear the silence no longer, she saw something ahead, a piece of fabric. Her breath hitched as she rushed forward, kneeling to pick it up. It was small, pink, damp with grime. Emily's sweater. Her stomach clenched painfully. She was here, she whispered. Carter crouched beside her. This doesn't look torn. She didn't lose it by accident. Someone took it off her. Sarah's fingers trembled as she clutched the tiny sweater. It was still warm, recently worn. A sickening thought formed in her mind. Someone had taken Emily's jacket off, which meant someone had been with her. Carter straightened, his face unreadable. We keep moving, Sarah nodded, stuffing the sweater into her jacket pocket. They walked for what felt like hours, the darkness thickening with each step. And then something changed. The air grew heavier, thicker. A sound, so faint she almost missed it, echoed through the tunnel. A whisper. Sarah's body went rigid. Did you hear that? Carter was already reaching for his radio. This is Carter, we have possible movement in the tunnel. Another whisper. Sarah turned her head sharply, her heart hammering in her throat. It was soft, barely audible. A child's voice. Mommy? Her breath caught. Emily. Emily. Sarah ran forward before Carter could stop her. The tunnel twisted sharply, and as she turned the corner, her pulse nearly stopped. There she was, standing in the center of the tunnel, barefoot, her small frame barely visible in the dim emergency light overhead. Her long blonde hair was tangled, her dress stained with dirt and grime. She was clutching something in her tiny hands. A rat. Sarah skidded to a halt, barely able to process what she was seeing. Emily. Her voice cracked. Baby, it's me. Emily didn't move, didn't react. She just stood there, staring. Sarah's stomach twisted. Emily, sweetheart, we have to go. Come to me. Emily tilted her head slightly, as if trying to remember something. And then, in a soft, distant voice, she whispered, I can't. Sarah's knees nearly gave out. What do you mean, you can't? Emily's grip on the rat tightened. I have to stay. Sarah took a cautious step forward. No, baby, you don't. You're coming home with me. For the first time, Emily's lips trembled. But I don't have a home. Not anymore. The words knocked the air from Sarah's lungs. She couldn't move, couldn't think. Carter stepped beside her, his voice calm but firm. Emily, we're here to help. You're safe now. Emily finally looked up at them. And what Sarah saw in her daughter's eyes sent ice through her veins. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was something else entirely. Acceptance. Like she had made peace with something Sarah couldn't understand. And then, so softly that Sarah almost missed it, Emily whispered, "I'm not Emily anymore." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The cold, damp air of the tunnel seemed to close in around her, suffocating her, pressing against her chest with an unbearable weight. She took a slow step forward, her entire body trembling, her mind refusing to process what she had just heard. Emily's voice, her daughter's soft, innocent voice, had whispered words that made no sense, words that felt like a knife twisting deep inside her. "I'm not Emily anymore." Her hands clenched into fists as she swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "Baby," she whispered, her voice barely holding steady. "Of course you are. You're Emily Carter. You're my daughter. I've been looking for you. I love you. Please, sweetheart, come to me." Emily didn't move. She simply stood there in the dim tunnel, her bare feet pressed against the damp concrete, her tiny fingers still curled tightly around the rat in her hands. She looked so small, so fragile, and yet there was something disturbingly distant in her expression. Her blue eyes, usually filled with warmth and curiosity, were vacant, empty pools of something Sarah couldn't understand. Detective Carter stepped beside her, his stance careful, controlled, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to a child behaving like this. "Emily," his voice was low but firm, an anchor in the suffocating silence. "You're safe now. We came to bring you home." Emily's small lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but then she looked down at the rat she was holding, gently stroking its matted fur. "I already have a home," she murmured, her voice eerily soft. "Down here, with them." Sarah's stomach twisted violently. "Them?" The word barely escaped her lips. Emily finally lifted her gaze, and for the first time since they had found her, there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Something unreadable. "The others," she whispered. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She turned to Carter, panic rising inside her like a tidal wave. "What is she talking about?" Carter didn't answer. He was staring at Emily with the same unease Sarah felt, his jaw tight, his hands hovering near his belt like he was preparing for something. But he didn't know what. Sarah took another step closer, her voice pleading now. "Emily, baby, there's no one else here. Just us. It's time to come home." Emily flinched at the word home. Her tiny fingers dug into the rat's fur, and the animal let out a soft squeak. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You don't understand. He told me I can't leave." The air in Sarah's lungs turned to ice. "Who?" Emily blinked slowly, like she was considering the question, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to answer. Then, in that same eerie whisper, she said, "Daddy." Sarah felt her knees buckle. The tunnel seemed to sway around her, the ground beneath her feet suddenly unstable. Her mind reeled. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. No, that wasn't possible. Daniel was gone. He had disappeared after the accident. He had abandoned them. He wasn't here. He couldn't be here. Carter stepped forward, his body tensing. "Emily," his voice was cautious now, edged with something Sarah couldn't quite place. "Are you saying your father is here? Down in the tunnels?" Emily hesitated. Then slowly she nodded. Sarah's entire body went rigid. "No," she breathed, shaking her head. "That's not. He's not." Her voice broke, and she turned to Carter, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might shatter. "He's lying to her," she whispered desperately. "Someone's lying to her. He's not here. He's not here." Carter's expression was unreadable, but there was something dark behind his eyes, something that told her he wasn't sure she was right. "Emily," he said carefully, "when did you see your father?" Emily's gaze flickered, her fingers still stroking the rat absent-mindedly. "Last night," she said simply. Sarah's breath hitched. Carter glanced at her, then back at Emily. "And what did he say?" Emily blinked. "He said I had to stay here." Sarah took a sharp, staggering breath. "Why?" Emily's lips pressed together tightly, and for a moment, she looked almost afraid. Then, in the faintest whisper, she said, "Because if I leave, he'll disappear again." Sarah's chest constricted with a pain so deep it felt unbearable. Tears burned her eyes, but she forced them back, shaking her head, trying to make sense of this. "Emily, baby, listen to me." She stepped forward again, reaching out a trembling hand. "Daddy's not here. Someone is lying to you. Someone is making you think he is." Emily flinched. "No." Her voice was sharper now, defensive. "He is here. I see him. He talks to me. He told me to wait. He told me you wouldn't understand." Sarah's stomach twisted violently. Emily's small fingers trembled as she clutched the rat closer to her chest, as if seeking comfort from it. Her eyes darted to the darkness behind her, into the deep tunnel where the light no longer reached. "He told me to wait," she repeated. "He told me you'd come. But I can't go with you. If I do, he'll be gone forever." Carter exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw, thinking. Then he took a step forward. "Emily," he said carefully, his voice calm but firm, "I need you to tell me exactly where you saw your father. Can you do that for me?" Emily hesitated again. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she turned her head slightly and pointed into the darkness. "Down there," she whispered. Sarah followed her gaze, her heart slamming against her ribs. There was nothing but pitch-black shadows ahead, a tunnel that stretched endlessly beneath the city. Carter exhaled through his nose, nodding slowly. "Okay." He turned to one of the officers standing by the entrance. "I need a search team down here now. Full sweep." Emily's expression changed. Her eyes widened, her body tensed. "No," she whispered. "You can't." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Why?" Emily shook her head quickly. "He said no one can follow him. He said if they do, bad things will happen." A heavy silence fell over the tunnel. Carter's face darkened. He exchanged a look with Sarah, something unspoken passing between them. Then he turned back to Emily, his voice softer now. "Sweetheart, we have to find him. If he's here, we need to help him. Don't you want that?" Emily looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable flickering behind her blue eyes. Then, so softly that Sarah almost missed it, she murmured, "You won't find him." Carter frowned. "Why not?" Emily blinked slowly, her grip on the rat tightening again. "Because he doesn't want to be found." A chill shot through Sarah's spine. Her breath caught. Emily lifted her gaze to meet her mother's, and for the first time since they had found her, there was something raw, something almost knowing in her small face. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "He told me the truth, Mommy. He told me why he left. And he told me why you lied." Sarah's entire body went rigid. The world around her seemed to tilt. "What?" Emily didn't blink. "You lied to me." Sarah's breath hitched, her vision blurred. The walls of the tunnel seemed to press in around her, suffocating her. And in that moment she knew, whatever had happened to Emily in these tunnels, whatever she had been told, it had changed everything, forever. Sarah felt like the ground beneath her had vanished. Her daughter's words echoed through her skull, wrapping around her like chains, tightening with every second. "You lied to me." No, that wasn't right. That wasn't possible." Emily was confused. Someone had manipulated her, twisted her memories, planted ideas in her head that weren't true. That was the only explanation. It had to be. She took a step forward, her breath uneven, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. "Emily, sweetheart, I need you to listen to me." Her voice was shaking, but she fought to keep it steady. "I don't know what you think I lied about, but I swear to you, I have never." Emily flinched, taking a step back. "Don't," she whispered. Sarah stopped cold. Emily's grip on the rat tightened as she hugged it against her chest. Her tiny shoulders trembled. "He told me everything," she murmured. "He told me why you wanted to leave that night. He told me why you were scared. It wasn't because of him. It was because of you." Sarah's breath caught. Carter, who had been silent, shifted beside her. His stance was tense, his gaze locked onto Emily, his mind undoubtedly running through every possible explanation. But Sarah barely noticed him. Her entire world had narrowed to the small, fragile child standing before her, the child who no longer trusted her. "Baby," she whispered, "I love you. I would never hurt you. I would never lie to you." Emily's eyes flickered, something almost desperate passing through them. "That's what he said you'd say," she murmured. "That you'd pretend. That you'd try to take me away from him again." A sharp, suffocating pain spread through Sarah's chest. "Emily, please. I don't know who's been talking to you. I don't know what they told you. But I need you to come home with me. Please." Emily shook her head violently. "No." The rejection hit Sarah like a slap. Carter exhaled slowly. His voice was careful when he spoke. "Emily, where's your father now?" Emily's fingers twitched against the rat's fur. "I don't know. Was he here when we came in?" Emily hesitated. Then, after a long pause, she shook her head. "He left." Sarah swallowed hard. "When?" Emily's gaze darted to the darkness behind her, into the tunnel that stretched deeper into the underground maze beneath the city. "Before you got here, he said I had to stay. He said I had to wait for you." A sharp chill raced down Sarah's spine. "Why?" Emily's fingers clenched tighter around the rat. "So I could decide." Carter's jaw tightened. "Decide what?" Emily blinked up at him. "Who I belong to." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The words wrapped around her, cold and unshakable. Carter's voice was lower now, quieter. "Emily, listen to me. No one gets to decide that but you. No one owns you. You are a little girl. You have a mother who loves you. A home that is safe for you." Emily flinched again, squeezing her eyes shut. "Stop." Sarah's heart clenched. "Emily." Emily's eyes snapped open, and when she looked at Sarah this time, there was something raw in her gaze. "I remember, Mommy." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. "I remember everything." Sarah took a shaky breath. "Baby, what are you talking about?" Emily's lips trembled. "You didn't crash the car that night because of the rain. You crashed it because you were running. You crashed it because you were scared. Because you knew that if you didn't leave, someone was going to find out what you did." Sarah felt like she had been punched in the chest. Carter's head turned sharply toward her. His expression remained unreadable, but there was a new tension in his stance, a new suspicion. Sarah's mouth opened, but no words came out. Emily stared at her mother, something painful, something conflicted swirling in her young eyes. "You were going to take me away from him," she whispered, "and you were never going to tell me why." Sarah's breath came in short, desperate bursts. Her mind was spinning. Her body was shaking. No, this wasn't real. This wasn't happening. "Emily," she rasped, her vision blurring. "I was trying to protect you." Emily blinked slowly. "From what?" Sarah opened her mouth. She couldn't answer, because the truth, the real truth, was something she had buried so deeply inside herself that even now, she could barely face it. Carter's voice broke the silence. It was low, but sharp. "Sarah, what is she talking about?" Sarah's hands trembled. She couldn't look at him. She couldn't look at anything but the tiny, fragile girl standing before her, the girl whose trust had been shattered into pieces. Emily's voice was even softer now. "I remember what happened that night." Her small fingers curled against the rat's fur. "I remember waking up before the crash. I remember hearing your voice." Sarah's heart stopped. Emily's lips parted. "You were on the phone with someone." Sarah's stomach lurched. Emily swallowed hard, tears pooling in her eyes. "You said you had to leave before he found out." A deep, sharp breath ripped through Sarah's chest. "Emily." Emily's voice cracked. "You weren't running from Daddy. You were running from me." The air around them seemed to freeze. Sarah couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Carter took a slow, deliberate step back, his eyes never leaving Sarah. "Sarah," his voice was tight. "What the hell is she talking about?" Sarah's fingers twitched against Emily's stuffed rabbit. Emily was shaking now. "He told me, Mommy. He told me everything." You didn't leave because you were scared of him. You left because you were scared of what I would remember. Sarah's vision blurred. A deep, gut-wrenching terror curled inside her, wrapping around her lungs, her ribs, her throat. Carter's voice was firm now. Sarah, what did you do? Sarah couldn't speak. Emily took a slow step forward, her tiny hands clenched into fists. You lied to me, Sarah gasped, her knees buckling. Emily's blue eyes burned into her. You knew I would remember. Sarah's pulse slammed violently against her ribs. Her entire body was shaking. Emily took another step closer. Her voice was softer now. Tell me what really happened. Sarah's breath caught. Her vision spun, because for the first time since she had woken up in that hospital bed, she finally understood. Emily knew. She had always known. And now, she wanted the truth. The world around Sarah was collapsing. The walls of the tunnel, the cold concrete beneath her feet, the damp air pressing against her skin. It all faded into nothing, swallowed by the unbearable weight of her daughter's words. Tell me what really happened. The sentence echoed inside her skull, a relentless, crushing force she couldn't escape. Emily stood before her, small and fragile, yet filled with a certainty that made Sarah's blood run cold. How could this be happening? How could everything unravel so quickly? Her breath came in short, uneven gasps, her pulse hammering in her ears. Emily, she whispered, her voice barely holding together. You don't understand. Emily's tiny hands clenched at her sides, her blue eyes dark and unreadable. Then make me understand. Sarah's chest tightened. Panic clawed its way up her throat, desperate, suffocating. Her body screamed at her to run, to deny, to lie. But she couldn't. Not anymore. Detective Carter took a slow step forward, his presence a heavy weight in the suffocating silence. His voice was low, controlled, but edged with something sharp. Sarah, he said carefully, is there something you need to tell us? Sarah's lips trembled. She turned, meeting his gaze, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, she saw it, the doubt, the suspicion creeping into his eyes. No, she couldn't let this happen. She turned back to Emily, her voice breaking. Baby, please, I love you. I did everything for you. Emily flinched. Then why did you try to take me away from him? Sarah swallowed hard. Because I was scared. Emily's fingers twitched. Of what? Sarah exhaled shakily, her vision blurring. Of losing you. Emily's brow furrowed, something uncertain flickering across her face. But I was with you. I was always with you. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back the wave of emotions crashing inside her. No, sweetheart, you weren't. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to meet Emily's gaze. You were always with him. Emily's breath caught. The tunnel was silent. Carter's voice was a razor-sharp whisper. What does that mean? Sarah's hands trembled. She could feel it unraveling, the truth slipping free like an avalanche, unstoppable, merciless. She turned to Carter, her voice raw. I wasn't the only one keeping secrets. Carter's jaw tightened. Sarah, start talking. Now. Sarah looked at Emily again, tears pooling in her eyes. Baby, I never meant for you to find out like this. Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. Find out what? Sarah's breath hitched. And then, she said it. Daniel isn't your father. The words crashed into the tunnel like a violent storm. The impact immediate, shattering. Emily took a sharp step back, her breath hitching, her small fingers trembling against the rat she still held. What? Sarah's throat burned. I'm so sorry, baby. I wanted to tell you when you were older, when you could understand, but... Emily shook her head, stepping back again. No, she whispered, her voice cracking. That's not true. That's not true. Carter exhaled sharply, his expression dark. Who is? Sarah's entire body trembled. Her voice barely made it past her lips. Richard Sterling. The silence that followed was unbearable. Emily's breath came in ragged bursts, her small frame shaking violently. No, she choked. You're lying. Daddy said you'd lie. Sarah felt like she was drowning. I'm not lying, baby. I swear to you, I'm not. Emily's eyes filled with tears, panic rising in her expression. "No," she gasped. "No, no, no, he's my daddy, he's my daddy." Sarah reached for her, desperation clawing at her chest. "Sweetheart, please," Emily screamed. The sound ripped through the tunnel, raw and broken, filled with something far deeper than just fear. It was betrayal. It was devastation. It was the sound of a child's world collapsing around her. Carter cursed under his breath, stepping between them as Emily's small body shook with sobs. "Sarah, what the hell is going on?" Sarah wiped at her tears, her hands unsteady. "Daniel and we were married, but before Emily was born, things weren't good between us. I made mistakes." Her voice broke. "Richard was one of them." Carter's expression darkened. "And Daniel knew?" Sarah nodded. "Not at first, but when he found out, he didn't care. He loved her. He raised her." Emily's breath was ragged, her small hands pressing against her ears. "Stop," she begged. "Stop saying that." Sarah's heart shattered. "Baby, no!" Emily turned and ran. Sarah's blood turned to ice. "Emily!" She took off after her, but Carter grabbed her arm, holding her back. "Sarah, stop!" Sarah fought against him. "Let me go!" Carter's grip tightened. "You need to give her a second." "No, I don't," Sarah sobbed. "That's my child." But Emily was already gone, disappearing into the darkness of the tunnel. Sarah's entire body shook, her mind spiraling into blind panic. "We have to find her." Carter grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, I need every available unit down here now. Child missing in the tunnels. 5 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes." Sarah barely heard him. Her pulse was deafening in her ears. She turned back toward the darkness. Emily was running, and this time Sarah didn't know if she could bring her back. Sarah's feet pounded against the wet ground as she ran deeper into the tunnel, her breath ragged, her vision blurring from the tears she could no longer hold back. The cold, damp air felt suffocating, thick with moisture and the scent of rust and decay. The tunnel stretched endlessly before her, a black void swallowing every flicker of light behind her. Emily was gone, her small figure disappearing into the darkness, her footsteps echoing like fading whispers against the concrete walls. "Emily!" Sarah's voice cracked as she screamed, desperation clawing at her throat. "Baby, stop, please." But there was no response, only the sound of running water somewhere deep within the tunnel. Carter's footsteps thundered behind her. "Sarah, slow down. You don't know where she's going." Sarah ignored him. Her heart was breaking, her mind spiraling. Emily was running from her. Her daughter, her baby, had looked at her with a pain so deep, so raw, that Sarah had felt it slice through her own chest. She had lost her. She had lost her the moment she spoke the truth. Her lungs burned, her legs aching as she pushed herself forward. "Emily, please. I love you. I swear to you. I love you." Still nothing. Sarah's pulse slammed in her ears, deafening. "You're my daughter. You always will be." The words echoed off the tunnel walls, but they sounded empty now, hollow. And then, suddenly, there was a sound. A sharp, small sob, barely audible above the rush of Sarah's heartbeat. Sarah skidded to a stop, her breath catching. She turned her head wildly, scanning the darkness. "Emily?" A sniffle, a shuddering breath. Sarah's pulse slammed against her ribs. "Sweetheart, I hear you. I'm right here. Please, baby, please let me see you." A beat of silence. Then, finally, a whisper so small, so broken. "You lied to me." Sarah's chest caved. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe. "I know, baby, and I was wrong. I should have told you the truth from the beginning. But I need you to understand. I did it because I love you. Because I was scared of losing you." A shadow shifted in the darkness. A tiny figure, barely visible, crouched near the base of the tunnel wall. "Emily." Sarah's breath shuddered. Emily's tiny arms were wrapped tightly around herself, her small body trembling. Her face was buried against her knees, her blonde hair falling in tangled waves around her shoulders. She looked so small, so fragile. Her tiny fingers curled into her sleeves as if she were trying to disappear. Sarah's heart splintered into pieces. She took a slow step forward, her voice shaking. "Baby, please look at me." Emily didn't move. Carter came up beside Sarah, his breath heavy from the chase. He glanced at her, then back at Emily, his expression unreadable. Sarah swallowed past the lump in her throat. "Emily, I know you're hurting, and I know you're mad at me. You have every right to be, but I need you to come with me now. I need you to let me bring you home." Emily flinched at the word home. Sarah's stomach clenched. "Sweetheart, please." Emily's fingers twitched. I don't have a home." Sarah's entire body tensed. Emily lifted her head slightly, her blue eyes rimmed with tears. "I don't know who I am anymore." Sarah felt her knees buckle. "Yes, you do." She dropped to her knees, bringing herself level with Emily. "You are Emily Carter. You are my daughter. And I love you more than anything in this world. That will never change." Emily sniffled, her tiny hands clenching against her dress. "But Daddy," Sarah's breath caught. "Baby, I know you love him, and I know this is confusing, but just because Daniel wasn't your biological father doesn't mean he didn't love you. He raised you, he chose you, and that means something." Emily's chin quivered. "Then why did he leave?" Sarah's throat burned. She blinked hard against the sting in her eyes. "Because he was scared. Because he didn't know what to do." Emily stared at her for a long moment. "And you? Why did you leave?" Sarah's pulse faltered. Her breath turned shallow. Because that was the question she had been running from. The question she had prayed Emily would never ask. The truth curled inside her like a vice, suffocating, inescapable. She swallowed hard. "Because I knew." Emily's breath hitched. Sarah's vision blurred. "I knew the truth. I knew that one day you'd have to hear it. And I was terrified of what it would do to you. So I ran. I ran because I didn't want to face what I had done. I ran because I was selfish." Emily's lips trembled. Sarah reached out slowly, her fingers shaking. "But I'm done running, baby. I am done hiding from the truth. And I will spend every day of my life proving that to you. I will never leave you again. I swear it." Emily's small body shook. Her breath came in uneven bursts, her fingers gripping the fabric of her dress so tightly her knuckles turned white. Sarah's voice cracked. "Sweetheart, I need you to trust me. Just one more time. I need you to let me bring you home." Emily hesitated. Sarah's heart pounded. And then, finally, Emily nodded. Sarah collapsed forward, pulling her daughter into her arms. A sob tore through her chest as she held Emily tightly against her, her fingers tangling in her hair, her entire body shaking with relief. "Oh, baby, I love you," she whispered, pressing frantic kisses against Emily's hair. "I love you so much." Emily clung to her, her tiny hands fisting in Sarah's jacket. "I want to go home." Sarah choked on a breath. "Okay, sweetheart, we're going home." She looked up, locking eyes with Carter, who gave her a small nod. Sarah tightened her hold on Emily, never wanting to let go, because this time, she wouldn't. The weight of Emily's small body in Sarah's arms felt both grounding and unbearable. She had her daughter back, but the damage had already been done. The truth had shattered Emily's trust, had fractured the fragile world Sarah had tried so desperately to protect. And now, as she carried her daughter out of the tunnels, her heart clenched with the realization that things would never be the same again. Detective Carter led the way, his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows against the damp concrete walls. The tunnel stretched endlessly ahead of them, the dripping water and distant echoes creating a suffocating silence. Every step Sarah took felt heavier, her breath shallow, her mind racing. Emily was holding on to her, but barely. Her tiny hands were curled weakly into Sarah's jacket, her face buried against her shoulder. She wasn't crying anymore, but her body trembled with exhaustion, with emotions too overwhelming for her young mind to process. Carter glanced back over his shoulder. "We're almost out," he said quietly. "The search teams are waiting at the entrance." Sarah barely registered his words. Her focus remained on the fragile child in her arms, on the steady but distant rhythm of Emily's breathing. She had found her, but she was losing her in a different way. As they neared the tunnel's entrance, the harsh glare of emergency lights flooded their path. Shadows of uniformed officers and paramedics moved in and out of sight, their voices murmuring in low, urgent tones. The contrast between the quiet, suffocating darkness of the tunnels and the chaotic brightness of the outside world was jarring. Sarah stepped out into the open air, blinking against the sudden assault of artificial light. The night sky above was still a deep, stormy gray, the air thick with the lingering scent of rain. Over here, a paramedic rushed forward, reaching for Emily. Sarah hesitated, her grip tightening instinctively around her daughter. "Ma'am, we need to check her vitals," the paramedic insisted gently. "She's been underground for a long time. We need to make sure she's okay." Sarah swallowed hard. Emily made no move to resist as the paramedic carefully lifted her from Sarah's arms and carried her toward the ambulance. Sarah followed, her chest constricting as she watched them settle Emily onto the stretcher. The child lay still, her wide blue eyes staring blankly at the ceiling of the ambulance. She looked so small, so fragile, and Sarah's stomach twisted painfully at the distant emptiness in her expression. "She's in mild shock," the paramedic said, checking her pulse. "We'll take her to the hospital for further evaluation. But she's stable." "Stable." Sarah let out a shaky breath, nodding. "I'm going with her." Carter placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, we need to talk first." Sarah turned to him, her body tense, her mind still reeling. "Now?" Carter's face was unreadable. "Now?" Sarah hesitated, glancing at Emily again. The paramedics were busy securing her for transport, speaking to her in soft, soothing tones. But Emily wasn't responding. She just stared, silent. Sarah's stomach churned. Carter's voice was quiet but firm. "She's safe. Let them do their job." Sarah's shoulders slumped in defeat. She nodded reluctantly, stepping back as the ambulance doors closed. The vehicle pulled away, its flashing lights cutting through the darkness as it disappeared down the street. Sarah turned back to Carter, her hands trembling. "What do you want to know?" Carter studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching. "Start from the beginning. The real beginning." Sarah inhaled sharply, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to hold herself together. She had spent years running from this moment, years pretending it would never come. And now there was no escape. "I met Richard Sterling when I was 22, she said quietly. "I was young, naive. I didn't know who he really was at first. He was charming, powerful. He made me feel like I was the only person in the world who mattered." She exhaled shakily. But it was a lie. He wasn't who he pretended to be. Carter's jaw tightened. "And Daniel?" Sarah swallowed. "Daniel and I had already been married for a year when I met Richard." Carter's expression darkened. "So you had an affair?" Sarah flinched. The word stung even after all these years. "Yes," Carter sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "And when did you find out you were pregnant?" Sarah's breath hitched. "A few months later." "And you told Daniel?" Sarah nodded slowly. "I was terrified. I thought he would leave me. I thought I had ruined everything. But when I told him, he didn't get angry. He didn't blame me. He just..." She trailed off, blinking against the sting of tears. "He just held me. He told me it didn't matter. That Emily was our daughter, no matter what." Carter exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "And Sterling?" Sarah's stomach twisted. "He never knew." Carter's head snapped up. "What?" Sarah wrapped her arms tighter around herself. "I never told him." Carter stared at her in disbelief. "You're telling me Richard Sterling, one of the most powerful men in this city, never knew he had a daughter?" Sarah swallowed hard. "Not until recently." Carter let out a slow breath. "And Daniel? He found out." Sarah nodded. "I don't know how, but when he did, everything changed." Carter's gaze sharpened. "That's why he left." Sarah's chest ached. "He said he couldn't do it anymore. He said he had spent 5 years living a lie, and he couldn't keep pretending." He left that night. And her voice broke. I tried to follow him. I got in the car. Emily was asleep in the back. I didn't know where I was going. She took a shaky breath. Then I crashed. Carter was silent for a long moment. Finally, he exhaled. Jesus Christ, Sarah. Sarah wiped at her eyes. I never meant for any of this to happen. I was just trying to protect her. Carter studied her, his expression unreadable. And Sterling? How did he find out? Sarah hesitated. I don't know, but he did. And now I don't know what he's going to do. Carter's gaze darkened. Sarah's stomach twisted. What if he tries to take her? Carter's jaw tightened. We won't let that happen. Sarah's breath shook. It's too late. Carter frowned. What do you mean? Sarah turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. He already found her once. Carter's blood ran cold. What? Sarah clenched her fists. Emily didn't just disappear into those tunnels on her own. She lifted her gaze. Her eyes filled with something raw. Someone led her there. Carter's expression darkened instantly, his body tensing as Sarah's words settled between them like a bomb waiting to explode. Someone led her there? His voice was sharp, cutting through the thick night air. Are you saying this wasn't just her running off on her own? Sarah swallowed hard, nodding. I don't think she was alone when she left the crash site. Her hands clenched into fists as she forced herself to breathe through the suffocating weight of her own words. Someone was waiting for her. Carter exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. Jesus. Sarah turned away, wrapping her arms around herself as she stared toward the empty street where the ambulance had disappeared moments before. Emily was safe for now, but the truth was unraveling too quickly. And the more pieces fell into place, the more terrifying the reality became. Carter took a step closer, his voice quieter but no less intense. Sarah, who do you think it was? She hesitated. She already knew the answer. She had known it the moment Emily had looked her in the eyes and whispered about the man who had told her to stay. But saying it out loud would make it real. It would take whatever fragile hope she had left and crush it completely. Still, she forced herself to speak. Daniel, she whispered. Carter's entire body stiffened. You're telling me Daniel Carter, the man who vanished into thin air after your accident, was there that night? That he was the one who took Emily? Sarah's throat tightened. I don't know if he took her, but I know she saw him. She believes he was there. Carter shook his head, his brows furrowed in thought. Sarah, we have no proof that Daniel is even alive. No bank activity, no sightings, nothing. If he's been off the grid for this long, why the hell would he suddenly show up now? And why would he lead Emily into an underground tunnel instead of just taking her outright? Sarah exhaled shakily. Because he was trying to keep her hidden. Carter's gaze sharpened. Hidden from who? Sarah turned to face him fully, her pulse pounding in her ears. From Richard Sterling. The silence that followed was suffocating. Carter stared at her, his jaw tightening. You really think Sterling would go after his own daughter? Sarah's stomach twisted. I think he's already been looking for her. And I think Daniel knew that. Carter cursed under his breath, pacing a few steps away before turning back to her. Okay, let's say you're right. Let's say Daniel is alive. And let's say he did take Emily to keep her hidden from Sterling. That still doesn't explain why she was so convinced that you were the one lying to her. What the hell did Daniel tell her? Sarah closed her eyes for a brief moment, the weight of everything pressing down on her like a crushing force. I don't know, but that was a lie, because deep down she did know. Daniel had spent 5 years raising Emily as his own. He had loved her, protected her, given her everything. And then one day he had learned the truth that Sarah had kept from him, the truth that Emily was never his to begin with. It had destroyed him, and now he was trying to destroy her. Carter studied her for a long moment before exhaling sharply. We need to find him. Sarah swallowed hard. How? We don't even know where he is. Carter's jaw tightened. Then we start with who does know. Sarah frowned. What are you talking about? Carter turned, pulling his phone from his pocket. Richard Sterling. Sarah's breath hitched. No, Carter barely glanced at her. "We don't have a choice, Sarah. If Sterling is looking for Emily, then he's got more resources than we do. If Daniel's been hiding her from him, then that means he has something to lose." Sarah's pulse raced. "You don't understand. If you go to him, you're giving him exactly what he wants." Carter's gaze flickered to her. "And what's that?" Sarah clenched her jaw, her stomach twisting painfully. "Proof." Carter stared at her, his expression unreadable. "Proof of what?" Sarah inhaled sharply. "Proof that Emily is his daughter." Carter exhaled slowly, rubbing his forehead. "Jesus Christ, Sarah." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, the reality of it all finally settling in her chest like a stone she couldn't dislodge. "If Sterling hasn't already figured it out, then once we go to him, he will. And once he knows the truth, he'll never stop until she's his." Carter was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he said, "Then we make sure he never finds out." Sarah's head snapped up. "How?" Carter's gaze was steady, unwavering. "We find Daniel first." Sarah's pulse jumped. "But we don't even know where to start." Carter held up his phone. "I do." Sarah's brows furrowed. "What?" Carter tapped the screen a few times before turning it toward her. A security camera feed popped up, grainy but clear enough to show a figure stepping into a gas station late at night. A figure Sarah recognized instantly. Her breath caught. "No." Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's him, Sarah. This was taken 2 nights ago." Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. "Where?" Carter's voice was steady. "A town 2 hours from here." Sarah's vision blurred. "He's close." Carter nodded. "Which means he never really left." Sarah's stomach twisted. Daniel had been here all along, and now she was finally going to find him. The realization hit Sarah like a freight train. Daniel had never truly left. While she had spent years believing he had abandoned them, he had been hiding in plain sight, waiting, watching, pulling strings she hadn't even known existed. And now, after all this time, she was finally going to confront him. Carter started the car without another word, his jaw tight, his movements sharp with restrained urgency. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, both of them knowing that this moment was bigger than anything they had faced so far. Sarah stared out the window as the city blurred past them, her fingers digging into the fabric of her jeans. Daniel, the man who had promised to love her, to stand by her side no matter what. The man who had once held Emily in his arms and whispered to her about all the dreams he had for her future. The man who had disappeared into nothing the moment he learned the truth. The man who had taken their daughter. Sarah closed her eyes, exhaling shakily. The pieces of the puzzle were finally snapping into place. But the picture they formed was something far more terrifying than she had expected. Carter's voice broke the silence. "We'll be there in 2 hours." The gas station footage was time-stamped at 2:37 a.m., which means he's been staying somewhere close. "We'll check the surrounding motels first." Sarah nodded, gripping the seatbelt tightly. "What if he runs again?" Carter's hands tightened on the wheel. "Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance." Sarah's stomach twisted. She wasn't sure what scared her more. The thought of seeing Daniel again, or the possibility that this time, she wouldn't recognize the man standing in front of her. The highway stretched ahead of them, endless and empty. The darkness outside seemed heavier, pressing against the windows as if the night itself was warning them to turn back. But Sarah knew there was no turning back now. Not when the truth was finally within reach. The first motel they checked was a dead end. A rundown place with flickering neon lights and a front desk clerk who barely looked up from his newspaper as Carter flashed his badge. No one matching Daniel's description had checked in. The second motel was the same. But the third was different. Carter parked the car at the far end of the lot, his eyes scanning the rows of rooms with an intensity that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The motel was quiet, too quiet, the air heavy with the scent of rain and gasoline. A single light flickered near the office, casting long shadows against the cracked pavement. Carter turned to her. "Stay here." Sarah's pulse spiked. "No." Carter sighed. "Sarah, I'm not staying in the car while you go in there alone." Her voice was firm, unshakable. This is my fight too. Carter studied her for a long moment before nodding. Fine, but you follow my lead. Sarah swallowed hard and followed him to the front office. The clerk inside was different from the others. He wasn't distracted, wasn't bored. He was alert, too alert. His eyes flickered to Carter's badge and then to Sarah, something calculating passing through his gaze. Carter leaned against the counter. We're looking for someone. The clerk didn't blink. A lot of people come through here. Carter slid a photo across the counter. Daniel's old driver's license. Have you seen him? The clerk hesitated. Why? Sarah's stomach clenched. Carter didn't flinch. Because we're not leaving until we do. The clerk exhaled through his nose, his fingers tapping against the desk. Then, finally, he nodded toward the far end of the lot. Room 17. Checked in 2 nights ago. Paid in cash. Hasn't left since. Sarah's breath hitched. Carter nodded. Appreciate it. They stepped back outside, the cold night air wrapping around them like a warning. Sarah's hands were shaking. Carter placed a firm hand on her shoulder. Are you ready for this? No, not even a little. But she nodded anyway. They walked toward room 17 in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them with every step. The door was closed, the curtains drawn tight. No sound, no movement. Carter knocked once. Silence. He knocked again. A rustling noise from inside. Sarah's pulse skyrocketed. Carter's voice was calm but edged with steel. Daniel, we know you're in there. Open the door. Silence again. Then, the lock clicked. The door creaked open just enough for Sarah to see him. Daniel. He looked different, thinner, darker. His face was gaunt, his beard unkempt, his eyes sunken and hollow. But it was him. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Daniel's gaze flickered between her and Carter, his expression unreadable. You shouldn't be here. Carter didn't move. Neither should you. Daniel exhaled slowly, then stepped back, opening the door wider. Come in. Sarah hesitated. Then, before she could change her mind, she stepped inside. The room was small, suffocating. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and something else. Something metallic, almost like rust. A single duffel bag sat in the corner, half-packed. He was ready to run. Sarah swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. Where is she? Daniel's gaze softened. She's safe. Sarah's stomach twisted. Where? Daniel? Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. I didn't take her to hurt you. Sarah's hands clenched. Then why did you? Daniel hesitated. Because I had to. Carter's voice was sharp. That's not an answer. Daniel's eyes flickered to him. It's the only one I can give you. Sarah took a shaky step forward. Daniel, I need the truth. No more lies. No more running. Just tell me why. Daniel's jaw tightened. Because she's not safe with you. Sarah's breath caught. What? Daniel's eyes were raw, haunted. I heard you that night, Sarah. Before the crash. I heard you on the phone. Sarah's blood ran cold. Daniel swallowed hard. You were talking to him. The room spun. Sarah's breath came in short, ragged bursts. No. Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. You were talking to Sterling. Sarah shook her head violently. No, Daniel, you don't understand. Daniel's hands curled into fists. I heard you, Sarah. You said you had to leave before he found out. You said you couldn't let him take her. His voice cracked. You were working with him. Sarah's vision blurred. Carter stiffened beside her. Daniel's voice was trembling now. You weren't trying to run from Sterling that night. His eyes locked onto hers, something breaking in his gaze. You were trying to bring Emily to him. The world around her collapsed. Sarah couldn't breathe. She couldn't move, because for the first time, she wasn't sure if he was wrong. Sarah's mind shattered. The walls of the small motel room seemed to close in on her, suffocating, distorting, warping into something unreal. Daniel's words pulsed in her skull like a war drum. Relentless, impossible, and yet carrying a weight so devastating she could feel it sinking into her bones. You were working with him. You were trying to bring Emily to him. No, that wasn't true. That couldn't be true. But the way Daniel looked at her, the raw certainty in his eyes, the way his entire body tensed as if he expected her to lunge at him, told her he believed it. And if he believed it, if Emily believed it, then what kind of mother had she become? Sarah took a shaky breath, her hands trembling at her sides. Her throat was dry, her pulse erratic. "Daniel," she whispered, barely able to force the words out, "I don't know what you think you heard, but I swear to you, I would never let him take her. I would never do that." Daniel exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening, his fingers curling against his palms. "Then why did you call him?" Sarah's stomach twisted violently. "I didn't." "You did." Daniel's voice was eerily calm, but beneath it, she could hear the crack, the fracture in his resolve. "I heard you, Sarah. I was standing in the doorway. You didn't see me, but I heard every word." Sarah's breath hitched. Carter, who had been silent until now, finally spoke, his voice low and edged with steel. "Daniel, if Sarah had been working with Sterling, why the hell would she be here right now? She spent every second since that night trying to find Emil." Daniel's gaze flickered to Carter, sharp and calculating. "Because she lost control. She thought she could handle it, thought she could manipulate the situation, but she couldn't. And now, she's scrambling, trying to fix something she never should have started." Sarah flinched as if she had been slapped. "Daniel, please listen to yourself. I love her. She is my daughter. I would never put her in danger. You know that." Daniel's eyes darkened. "I thought I did." The words stung, each syllable a blade slicing through her ribs. Sarah shook her head furiously. "You don't understand. That night I was trying to protect her. I was trying to protect us." Daniel let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Then why did you run?" Sarah's pulse pounded. "Because I was scared." "Of what?" Sarah's breath came in uneven gasps. "Of what he would do if he found out the truth." Daniel's expression shifted slightly, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. "So he didn't know back then?" Sarah swallowed hard. "No, but he suspected. He had been pressuring me for months, asking questions, trying to trap me into admitting it. I knew it was only a matter of time before he found out." Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. "And you were going to tell him?" Sarah hesitated. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unbearable. Carter narrowed his eyes. "Sarah." Sarah clenched her fists. "I didn't have a choice. He was closing in on us. If I hadn't told him, he would have taken Emily without my permission. I thought if I told him myself, I could control the situation." Daniel let out a sharp breath, stepping back as if the words had physically struck him. His entire body went rigid, his eyes dark with something Sarah couldn't quite name. "And you didn't think to tell me?" Sarah's throat burned. "I was going to, but then you left." Daniel shook his head. "No, Sarah, you left first. The moment you decided to make that call, the moment you tried to handle this alone, you left both of us behind." Sarah felt her chest constrict. "I was trying to protect you. By lying to me," Daniel's voice cracked. "By making me think that Emily was really mine, that we were safe, that everything we built was real." "It was real," Sarah's voice broke. "You were her father, Daniel. In every way that mattered, you were her father." Daniel inhaled sharply, his jaw clenching. "And yet, the moment the truth started catching up to you, you were willing to let him take her." Sarah's knees nearly buckled. "I wasn't going to let him take her. I was going to make a deal. I thought if I could convince him to stay away, if I could control the narrative, we could all be free." Daniel's gaze was unreadable now, his body still, too still. "And then what happened?" Sarah's breath caught. "Then you found out. Then everything fell apart." Daniel's fingers twitched at his sides. "And now, you expect me to believe you're suddenly the hero, that you're suddenly the one who's going to save her?" Sarah's lips trembled. "I don't expect you to believe anything. I just need you to trust me." Daniel let out a slow, measured breath. "I can't." The words were final, unforgiving, and they shattered something inside her. Carter shifted beside her, his gaze flickering between them. "Daniel, whether you trust her or not, we need to focus on what matters. Emily is out there, And Sterling is closer than ever. Daniel exhaled sharply, his hands shaking slightly as he dragged them through his hair. I know. Sarah's heart stopped. What do you mean, you know? Daniel's gaze locked onto hers, something almost haunted in his expression. Because I saw him. Sarah's breath hitched. When Daniel's jaw tightened. The night I took Emily. I was watching the house. I saw his car parked a few blocks away. He was waiting, watching. Sarah's stomach churned violently. Carter's face darkened. So he does know. Daniel nodded slowly. He knows. And he's been waiting for the perfect moment to take her. Sarah felt like she was going to be sick. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. That's why I had to take her first. Sarah swallowed the bile rising in her throat. Where is she now? Daniel hesitated. Carter took a sharp step forward. Daniel, where is she? Daniel's gaze flickered. Something vulnerable, something terrified flashing through his eyes. I didn't want to bring her here until I was sure. Until I knew what I was dealing with. Carter's patience snapped. Where is she? Daniel exhaled shakily. With someone I trust. Sarah's heart pounded violently against her ribs. Who? Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. And then, a knock at the door. Everyone froze. Sarah's breath caught, her pulse skyrocketing. Carter's hand moved instinctively to his hip, his entire body tensing. Daniel's eyes darkened. That's them. Sarah's stomach twisted. Who? Daniel inhaled deeply. Sterling's men. Carter cursed under his breath, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her behind him. We're leaving. Now. Daniel stepped forward, shaking his head. If you leave, they'll follow you. They want you to run. Sarah's breath hitched. Then what do we do? Another knock. Harder this time. Then, a voice. Calm, controlled, but filled with something lethal beneath the surface. Sarah, I know you're in there. Open the door. Sarah's entire body went rigid. Because she knew that voice. She had spent years fearing that voice. Richard Sterling had found them. Sarah's blood ran cold. The walls of the motel room seemed to close in on her, the air thickening into something suffocating, pressing against her chest with an unbearable weight. She could hear her own heartbeat, a frantic, wild thing in her ears. Richard Sterling was on the other side of that door. Carter's grip on her arm tightened, his body a wall between her and the looming threat just outside the flimsy motel door. His other hand hovered near his hip, his entire stance shifting into something calculating, protective. Daniel, however, was perfectly still, his expression unreadable, but his breathing had slowed, his shoulders rising and falling in a controlled rhythm like a man who had already resigned himself to the inevitable. The knock came again, slower this time, measured, as if whoever was on the other side knew exactly how much fear they were instilling. Sarah Sterling's voice was calm, controlled. Let's not make this difficult. Sarah's pulse spiked, her throat constricting. She looked at Daniel, but his face remained blank. Carter's voice was low, sharp. We're not opening that door. Daniel exhaled. Then they'll come in. Carter's jaw tightened. Let them try. Sarah's mind spun too fast, too violently. She had spent years fearing this moment, imagining the day Sterling would come for Emily. She had convinced herself she had time, that she could outrun this, could stay ahead of it. But now here he was standing just feet away, separated by nothing but a thin layer of wood and a lock that wouldn't hold if he really wanted to get inside. Another knock, then silence. Sarah's breath came in shallow bursts. She clenched her fists at her sides, forcing herself to think, forcing herself to find a way out of this. Daniel, where is she? Daniel's eyes flickered toward her. Safe. Where? She demanded, her voice breaking. Where is Emil? Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second too long, and Carter caught it instantly. Jesus Christ, Carter hissed, turning on him. You don't have her, do you? Daniel's silence was answer enough. Sarah felt the floor beneath her disappear. No, she whispered. No, Daniel, where is she? Daniel inhaled slowly. She's not with me, but she's safe. Sarah's stomach clenched, nausea rolling through her. Who did you leave her with? Daniel's jaw tightened. Someone I trust. Sarah's hands curled into fist. I swear to God, if you don't tell me right now. You think I would have brought her here? Daniel cut her off, his voice sharp. With him looking for her, with you looking for her, I had to move fast. I had to make sure she was somewhere he couldn't reach her. Carter stepped closer, his voice dangerously low. Who has her, Daniel? Daniel hesitated again, then finally, Lisa. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Lisa. Daniel nodded. I knew she'd do whatever it takes to protect her. Sarah's vision blurred rage, grief, and panic slamming into her all at once. Lisa is not capable of protecting her. Lisa is barely capable of protecting herself. Daniel's expression hardened. She's better than you. Sarah recoiled as if she had been slapped. Carter's patience snapped. You gave a 5-year-old to a woman who's been in and out of psychiatric care. Daniel's jaw clenched. She's not crazy, she's the only one who saw Sterling for what he really was before any of us. Sarah's body shook. She's unstable. Daniel's expression darkened. She's all we've got. A deep, slow breath came from the other side of the door, followed by Sterling's voice again. I'm starting to lose my patience. Carter turned back to Daniel. Where's Lisa? Where did you leave Emil? Daniel swallowed. Cabin up north, middle of nowhere, off the grid. Carter didn't hesitate. We're leaving? He grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the back exit of the motel room. Daniel moved to follow, but hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the door. Sterling's voice came again, quieter this time, but more dangerous. Sarah, if you run now, I will find you, and when I do, you won't like how this ends. A shudder ran through her entire body, but Carter didn't slow. He pushed open the back door, scanning the alley behind the motel before pulling her forward, Daniel close behind. They moved fast, slipping into the shadows as Carter led them toward his car parked on the other side of the lot. The air was thick with tension, every second stretching unbearably long. Sarah's breath came in short, panicked bursts, but she forced herself to keep moving. Carter yanked open the driver's side door, shoving Sarah into the passenger seat, before turning on Daniel. Back seat now. Daniel hesitated but climbed in. Carter slid behind the wheel, and within seconds the car was roaring to life, tires screeching against the pavement as they sped away from the motel, leaving Sterling and his men behind. Sarah's hands shook violently in her lap, her entire body trembling. Daniel exhaled behind her. We have a head start, but not for long. Carter's grip on the wheel was white-knuckled. Then we don't waste time. Sarah turned to Daniel, her voice raw. Where exactly is this cabin? Daniel exhaled, rattling off an address. Carter barely nodded, his focus locked on the road. The night stretched on the road ahead, a dark blur of endless pavement. Sarah's thoughts were spiraling, a frantic mess of fear and desperation. Emily was out there. Emily was alone. Lisa was with her, but Lisa had never been stable, not really. Her love was fierce but reckless, unpredictable. What if something had already happened? What if Sterling found her first? Sarah's breath shuddered, her hands clenching into fist. Daniel, if anything happens to her, if anything happens because of you. Daniel's voice was quiet. It won't. Sarah shook her head violently. You don't know that. Daniel hesitated. I trust Lisa. Sarah let out a sharp, broken laugh. You trust Lisa, but not me. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Carter's voice cut through the tension. Both of you shut up and hold on, we're getting her back. The car sped through the night, the weight of everything pressing down on them, suffocating and relentless. The road ahead was uncertain, but there was no turning back now. Emily was waiting, and Sarah would not fail her again.